All right, I'm going to pick up the pace a little bit here. We're going to carry on with now the development of the mandible. Once again, we go back to the first pharyngeal arch. We saw that the maxilla process grew off of that first pharyngeal arch, and then a little bit later we will start to see the development of these buddings, further buddings off of the mandibular arch called the mandibular process. And this is going to eventually form into the lower jaw, the lower parts of the face, and the anterior part of the tongue. Now, when the mandible develops, there's a bilateral bar of cartilage that appears within that first pharyngeal arch, and it's called Meckel's cartilage. I'm going to talk about that on a future slide, but this basically is going to support the mandible as it forms, because the mandible forms in several pads or units of tissue, and each one is named in response to various stimuli or development of muscles at the time. Once all of those pads fuse together, that will create the mature mandible, and a lot of the identifying features of the mandible remain named after their original parts. So if we look at the first part, we'll call the condylar unit up here. Now, this condylar unit forms the articulation with the skull, and it's made up of cartilage. So it's going to allow some movement of the mandible, and that will allow, and as it changes through development, of course, it will also remodel. And here we have the condylar process of the adult model of a mandible here. So you can see how it's basically was a pad of cartilage that was replaced by bone. The second portion is the body of the mandible, and this body is the center of the growth and function of the mandible. So we have our main body down in the adult mandible. The angular process, this little pad of tissue, now this will develop in response to the both the lateral pterygoid muscle and the masseter muscle development. And you'll have these little muscle attachments that form on some of these bones as a result. Then we have our coronoid process, this one up here. The coronoid process will form in response to the temporalis muscle development and will help to attach the bone to the skull. So here we have our coronoid process. And then finally, the alveolar process that forms in response to the developing teeth. So as our teeth form in that pad of tissue. So the Meckel's cartilage, that band of cartilage that forms in the region of the future lower jaw, the mandible itself actually grows on the anterior side of the cartilage, and basically this Meckel's cartilage will help to support the cartilage support the mandible during development. The mandible itself doesn't develop in an endochondral way, although we used to think that it did because Meckel's cartilage was there. But it does form mainly in an intramembranous fashion. So the development of the face has taken place. We've seen all of these components. There is a video of an adult face that has been identified, all these different processes, and that's in your student file or in your Blackboard shelf. So you can take a look at that. It's kind of cute, and it doesn't take long to watch. Now, the development of the tongue. The tongue basically develops from parts of the occipital portion of mesoderm and the first, second, and third pharyngeal arches. So it basically, oh, sorry, it basically, where did it go? There it is, sorry. That explains the unique innervation and musculature of the tongue and allows varied functions of the tongue to occur. So there's so many different muscles, as you probably remember from oral facial anatomy. You've got so many different muscles running in different directions. They've all come from a different part of the head and neck area. The tongue is made up of a specialized oral mucosa. It's a sac of epithelium containing voluntary muscles running in different directions. It's developed because the underlying mesenchyme is proliferating and growing and pushing that ectodermal surface outward. It grows straight up in the oral cavity of the stomodium during development, and that's how it gets its name, the dorsal surface of the tongue, which means back, because the top of the tongue is pointing towards the back of the stomodium, and the ventral surface is pointing toward the front of the stomodium initially. So the ventral surface means front in Latin, and dorsal means back. And this all starts in the primitive throat. So we'll start with the body of the tongue. Near the center line, so we're back to the first pharyngeal arch again, near the center line of the pharyngeal arch, and remember they're like a horseshoe band of shaped band of tissue, we're going to see three swellings. There's a large central swelling called the tuberculum impar, and there are two lateral lingual swellings. Those lateral lingual swellings are going to quickly grow over the tuberculum impar. At the same time that this is happening, a sulcus will form between the developing tongue and the jaw tissues, the mandible that is forming, so that it doesn't physically attach to the same surface of tissue. So we have all of these invaginations that are happening throughout the oral cavity as things change. So once these three swellings grow and unite, they're going to merge and form a single structure known as the body and the tip of the tongue. Eventually, the dorsal surface of this anterior 2/3, the body of the tongue, will be covered in a variety of papilla. The root of the tongue will grow below those initial lingual swellings, but again in the center line, but now between the second and the third pharyngeal arches. The swelling actually comes from the third swelling, and that swelling is called the hypobranchial eminence. This will be the structure that will become the root of the tongue. This eminence actually grows over the second arch and excludes the second arch from any further development. So really the root of the tongue comes from the third pharyngeal arch. All this is going on behind that where the root and the body fuse together is called the terminal sulcus. And this is all happening behind that last row of papilla called the circumvallate papilla at the very back of the tongue that have formed. And the base of the tongue is actually attached to the hyoid bone. So it's firmly attached in the neck area. That, as I said, the body of the tongue extends from the tip of the tongue to the terminal sulcus, where we have that V-shaped groove on the dorsal surface. And this is found just behind the V-shaped row of circumvallate papilla. At the very base of the V shape is a small pit-like depression called the foramen cecum. The foramen cecum is the original location of the thyroid gland. And the thyroid gland it started forming on the surface of the tongue, and it migrated down into the neck region by way of a duct system. But then that thyroglossal duct broke apart, and all that's remaining is a small little depression called the foramen cecum. but the thyroid gland has now formed in the neck. Because of the various contributions to the development of the tongue, it is also uniquely innervated in that the anterior 2/3 is derived from the first pharyngeal arch. It is innervated by the 5th cranial nerve. The posterior 1/3 of the tongue is innervated by the 7th, 9th, 10th, and 12th cranial nerves. And we'll stop this now.